Today, the Sahara looks like the last place on Earth where life could survive. An endless expanse of burning dunes stretching across an entire continent. Temperatures hot enough to kill within hours. Winds roaring across empty landscapes where almost nothing moves. To the modern world, the Sahara has become the ultimate symbol of desolation. A dead land swallowed by sand and silence. But hidden beneath that silence is a story so unbelievable that for decades, scientists struggled to fully understand it. Because this desert was once alive. Thousands of years ago, rivers cut through these lands like arteries. Massive lakes reflected the African sky. Grasslands rolled across the horizon, feeding enormous herds of animals. Elephants wandered where dunes now rise hundreds of feet high. Crocodiles hunted in deep waters. And unbelievably, hippos once swam across parts of the Sahara, deep inside caves now surrounded by emptiness. Ancient people left behind paintings of giraffes, cattle, hunters, and fertile landscapes, evidence of a lost world buried beneath the sand. So how did the largest hot desert on Earth become this way? How could an entire ecosystem simply vanish? The answer begins thousands of years ago, when the Sahara was not a desert at all, but one of the greenest places in Africa. Around 14,000 years ago, the Sahara entered a period scientists now call the African Humid Period, and the transformation was extraordinary. The endless dunes that dominate the region today were replaced by vast green savannas stretching across North Africa. Seasonal rain swept deep into the Sahara, feeding enormous river systems and creating lakes so massive they looked like inland seas from the sky. In places that are now among the driest on Earth, water once flowed constantly through valleys filled with thick vegetation and dense wildlife. Herds of antelope crossed open grasslands, while elephants moved through fertile plains covered in shrubs and trees. Giraffes roamed freely across landscapes that today are nothing but dust and rock. Crocodiles hunted in rivers and wetlands, and hippos floated in deep lakes beneath monsoon-fed skies. During rainy seasons, thunderstorms rolled across the Sahara, turning the region into a living, breathing ecosystem that barely resembles the desert we know now. But animals were not the only ones thriving here. Human communities spread throughout the Green Sahara, building lives around water sources that no longer exist. Fishing villages appeared along riverbanks and lake shores. Hunters tracked wildlife across the plains, while early cattle herders guided their livestock through open grasslands that could support entire communities. And scattered across caves and cliffs throughout the Sahara, these ancient people left behind evidence of the world they lived in. Rock paintings discovered deep inside the desert showed giraffes, cattle, swimmers, and hunting scenes carved into stone, thousands of years ago, proving that this barren land was once filled with life. The Sahara was not a desert at all. It was one of the richest environments in Africa. But that green world would not last forever. But this green world did not last forever, and the reason it collapsed was not a single disaster, a comet, or a sudden catastrophe. It was something far more subtle, something almost invisible on a human timescale. The Earth itself began to shift. Our planet does not move through space in a perfectly fixed way. Instead, it slowly changes its position and orientation over thousands of years. The tilt of the Earth, the shape of its orbit around the Sun, and even a slow wobble in its axis, all gradually shift in predictable cycles. These small variations might sound harmless, even meaningless, but they quietly control how sunlight reaches different parts of the planet over long periods of time. In the case of the Sahara, these changes slowly altered the balance of heat between the oceans and the African continent. As the angle and intensity of sunlight shifted, the African monsoon system, the massive weather engine that once brought life-giving rain deep into the desert, began to weaken. Year after year, the rains that once filled rivers and lakes started to retreat. At first, the change was barely noticeable. A slightly shorter rainy season, a few lakes shrinking at the edges, grasslands becoming less dense in certain regions. But over centuries, those small reductions in rainfall began to compound. Less rain meant fewer plants could survive. As vegetation thinned out, the ground became more exposed to direct sunlight. And here is where the transformation accelerated. Bare soil reflects and heats the atmosphere differently than lush green land, which means less vegetation led to changes in how heat was absorbed and circulated above the surface. This, in turn, weakened the monsoon rains even further. The system began to feed on itself. Less rain caused less vegetation, and less vegetation caused even less rain. A feedback loop slowly tightened across the region. What makes this story so striking is the scale of the cause compared to the effect. A slight shift in Earth's orbit, a gentle wobble in its axis, and a subtle change in solar exposure were enough to disrupt an entire climate system. Over time, what was once a green paradise began to lose its balance, inch by inch, until the transformation became impossible to reverse. A tiny astronomical adjustment had quietly set in motion one of the largest environmental changes in human history. As the subtle shifts in Earth's climate system continued, the transformation of the Sahara moved from slow imbalance to visible collapse. What had once been a thriving green landscape began to break apart in stages that ancient humans would have experienced within their own lifetimes. Rivers that once carried steady water through wide valleys began to shrink, their banks pulling inward as flow weakened year after year. Massive lakes that had reflected open skies started to recede, leaving behind cracked earth and shrinking shorelines that retreated further with each passing season. In places where water had once been permanent, it became seasonal, then unreliable, and finally gone. As the water disappeared, life followed. Animals that depended on these ecosystems began to migrate in search of survival. Herds of antelope and other grazing species moved farther and farther away as grasslands thinned and turned brittle. Crocodiles and hippos vanished from drying rivers and lakes. Even the great elephants that once roamed freely across the region were forced to follow the remaining corridors of water toward distant lands. What had been a balanced ecosystem was now breaking apart into isolated pockets of life surrounded by expanding dryness. The land itself began to change in appearance and behavior. Grasslands that once swayed under seasonal rains turned pale, then brittle, then disappeared entirely. Bare soil replaced vegetation, and with nothing left to hold the ground together, powerful dust storms became more frequent, sweeping across the exposed earth and reshaping the surface itself. The sky, once filled with moisture and rain clouds, grew clearer but harsher, dominated by heat and dry winds. For the human communities living across the region, this was not a distant or abstract shift. It was a direct and growing crisis. Fishing villages lost their waters. Hunting grounds became empty. Cattle herders watched pasture lands vanish before their eyes. In some areas, the change may have happened faster than expected, within just a few generations, leaving little time to adapt. Families and entire groups were forced to move, abandoning ancestral lands that could no longer support life. There must have been fear, confusion, and disbelief as people witnessed their world slowly disappear. Each generation would have remembered a slightly greener land than the one they inherited, until finally, there was nothing green left to remember at all. As the green landscapes of the Sahara continued to vanish, survival became the only priority for the people who once called it home. Entire communities that had lived for generations around lakes, rivers, and grasslands were forced into movement. This was not a planned migration. It was a slow, continuous exodus, driven by the disappearance of water itself. Families packed what little they could carry and followed the shrinking paths of rivers and seasonal streams, hoping each journey would lead them to a more stable environment. Over time, many of these migrating groups were drawn toward one of the only reliable lifelines in the region, the Nile Valley. Unlike the drying interior, the land surrounding the Nile River continued to receive consistent water flow, creating a narrow but fertile corridor through an increasingly arid landscape. As more people arrived, populations began to concentrate along its banks, clustering in ways that would have profound consequences for human history. This gathering of communities in a limited, resource-rich environment may have played a crucial role in the rise of early complex societies, with people living closer together, sharing water, and organizing around agriculture. Conditions became more favorable for structured settlements, leadership systems, and eventually the foundations of early civilization. What was once a scattered population spread across a green Sahara was now being reshaped into concentrated societies along a single river system. At the same time, the transformation of the Sahara into a vast desert created something equally important: separation. As the region dried out, it became a natural barrier between North Africa and the regions to the south. trade routes, migrations, and cultural exchanges that may have once flowed freely across the green landscape became far more difficult, redirecting the movement of people and ideas for thousands of years. A single environmental shift did more than change a landscape. It may have helped shape the very structure of African history and influenced the development of civilizations far beyond it. Even after the transformation was complete, the story of the Sahara was never fully erased. It was simply buried. Today, scientists and archaeologists continue to uncover clues that reveal just how different this land once was. From space, satellite imagery has mapped hidden patterns beneath the sand, ancient riverbeds and dry lake systems that snake across the desert like ghostly reminders of flowing water. These structures show that vast waterways once crossed regions that are now completely dry, confirming that the Sahara was once a connected, living landscape. On the ground, the evidence becomes even more striking. Fossils of animals that could never survive in a desert environment have been discovered deep within the sands. Remains of fish, crocodiles, and even whale-like species have been found in areas that are now hundreds of kilometers from any ocean. These discoveries point to a time when water was not just present, it was dominant, shaping the entire ecosystem. Scattered across rocky outcrops and hidden caves, ancient rock paintings add another layer to the mystery. These images depict elephants, giraffes, cattle, and human life thriving in environments that today are completely barren. They serve as direct visual testimony from people who witnessed a very different Sahara with their own eyes. Archaeologists have also uncovered traces of lost settlements, tools, pottery, and remnants of communities that once lived along now vanished lakes and rivers. Each discovery reinforces the same truth: the desert was not always a desert. Together, these clues form a hidden archive beneath the sand, silent, scattered, but powerful enough to prove that an entirely different world once existed, where endless dunes now stretch into the horizon. The story of the Sahara is more than a tale of the past. It is a reminder of how fragile Earth's systems truly are. What happened here shows that entire landscapes can change, not because of sudden catastrophes, but because of slow, almost invisible shifts in the planet's natural cycles. A slight change in sunlight, a subtle shift in rainfall, and over time, an entire ecosystem can collapse or be reborn. It is a powerful lesson. Environments are never permanent. What seems stable in one era can transform completely in another. The same orbital cycles that help turn a green Sahara into a desert are still moving today, continuing their long, predictable rhythm across thousands of years. And scientists believe that, far in the future, those same cycles could once again bring increased rainfall back to the region, slowly restoring parts of the Sahara to greener conditions. This ancient transformation also echoes into the present. It reminds us that climate systems are deeply interconnected, and even small changes can produce effects far larger than expected. The Earth is not static. It is constantly shifting, balancing, and responding. So the question is not just what the Sahara was or what it became, but what it could become again. Because in the long timeline of our planet, nothing stays fixed forever. And the truth is simple, yet almost impossible to imagine. The Sahara wasn't always a desert, and one day, it may not be again.